Today I'm going to show you how to turn this piece of wood into a chessboard. Alright guys, so step one is going to be milling up your lumber. If you don't know how to do that, that's fine. We have a video on our YouTube channel, so go check that out and mill up your lumber, and then we'll keep going. Hey everyone, welcome back to Hatfield Woodworking. Let's start off with the deal here. If I can show you how to make a purple heart and gold epoxy chessboard, you have to subscribe. Make sure to stick around because it turned out amazing. Alright, now that we've jointed one side and a face, go to your table saw, reference the side you jointed, and rip down the other side. So, first things first, we're going to start off with some basic lumber milling. What I'm doing is squaring up one side of my board using my table saw. Make sure when you're buying lumber you have enough for two 60-inch long by 1 1/2 inch wide strips that are about a 1/2 inch thick. Next, you'll need to rip one of those 60-inch long boards into 1 1/2 inch segments. I just did 3 20-inchers, but you could do a 60-inch as well. I want to highlight something special. I believe I'm the only one on YouTube providing a free and comprehensive guide on building an epoxy chessboard from start to finish. So, if you find this information helpful, please make sure to subscribe and hit the bell for more detailed woodworking content. Thank you. Now, make sure you cut at least 32 squares, but I'd recommend cutting around 36 to be safe. Next, take those squares and line them up in 8 by 8 rows. The height and length of these rows will determine the size of your chessboard, so we'll need a plywood base that's at least that big. I actually didn't have one, so I had to take 2 pieces of plywood and cut them up and do a small glue up. If you have to do this, it's no problem. It turned out fine for me. Next, we're going to lay out our template on the plywood. To do this, I started by drawing a large square with a pencil, which will serve as a boundary for our wooden squares. This large square needs to be precisely measured to ensure it will fit all the smaller squares perfectly. Next, I set down some double-sided tape so that my plywood base won't move and started arranging the squares. It takes a bit of time, but it's really important to get it right. Be sure to use some kind of glue. I'm using basic CA glue and an activator, but without glue your carefully placed squares might shift around in the epoxy, and it will turn your project into a big mess. So, it takes a while, but make sure to get this part right. It's very important and very rewarding. I made sure to use the same 2 blocks for all of my spacing. If you use different ones, you could get minor inconsistencies that could throw off your project. If you have any questions, be sure to ask. I'd love to make sure your project turns out great. So, what I'm doing right now is cutting strips of plywood that I'll use to make the mold for my epoxy pour. Make sure your plywood is at least a 1/4 inch taller than your wooden squares. You shouldn't have to measure. You should simply be able to mark and cut your plywood to fit the squares. I need to completely encase the edge of my squares with the plywood. Your mold needs to be almost perfect. Use caulking and screws to attach it to your plywood base. And please, make sure your plywood is wrapped in tuck tape or another tape that epoxy won't stick to. I forgot this step and almost ruined the whole project. So please, for your sake and mine, remember this. I waited for about a week to let my epoxy dry. Some epoxies take longer or shorter, but on average I'd wait about a week to make sure your epoxy is very, very dry. So, next you want to take out all your screws and remove your mold. Next, I went to the bandsaw and just cut off the excess wood on each side. Next, I headed over to the jointer to remove the excess plywood. Then I went to the table saw to square up the chessboard. After that, I planed it. Please be very careful when planing. If you're not cautious, you can destroy your whole project. Alright guys, it's going to be really hard for me to show you how to do this trim, so I'm just going to show you. Next, measure your chessboard's height and rip down 4 strips on your table saw to the height of your chessboard and however thick you want your trim to be. I went with about a 1/2 inch thick. Make sure that these strips are at least 15 inches long. I forgot to record unfortunately, but all you have to do is place your trim strips on your chessboard and mark on both sides. Next, cut a 45-degree angle on both sides where you marked. Make sure you mark them individually as well. you might have a small amount of difference between your sides, which could cause an unfortunate mishap. Next, I cleaned up the underside where there were some glue drips. I'm lucky enough to have a router sled to flatten and remove epoxy from the top, but careful planing would work too. Cleaned up my surface and hit the bottom with the router sled, and we're ready to move on to sanding. And then we will have our epoxy top coat, which is probably the coolest and my favorite part of the whole process. So stick around because we're almost done. Move up through the grits, starting with 80 and going up to about 300. This depends on your finish, but for me, I went up to about 300 and it worked just fine. Well, now there's nothing left to it but to do it. I've fulfilled my end of the deal, so now it's your turn. Make sure to hit that subscribe and like so you don't lose this video. I hope you learned a lot, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.